Hello and welcome back to the Gilbert F. Stansel Musical Instrument Museum here at Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp. My name is Dave Bauer and I am the curator of the museum. You know, technology is a really wonderful thing when it works the way it's supposed to, right? Well, how many of us have thought a lot about how technology has influenced the development of musical instruments? And I'm not just talking about the kinds of technology that have given us synthesizers and drum machines and other types of electronic instruments. I'm talking about mechanical technology that systematically and gradually over a long period of time was applied to the improvement and the development of musical instruments, and that it has brought them to being the sophisticated and complex and very versatile instruments that we all know and love today, and also probably take maybe a little bit for granted. Now, we have to trace this back many tens of thousands of years to the time when human beings, as they were developing, were beginning to use their voices to develop language. And a little bit farther down the line, after they developed language, they also found other ways of expressing themselves that weren't strictly for communication. And one of those ways of expressing themselves later on came to be called music. So after they found that they wanted to use something other than their voices for musical instrument, for expressing their musical thoughts, they began to look for some objects around them that might have originally been used as signaling devices, such as horns and conch shells and primitive drums and things like that. And they began to exploit the musical potential of those objects. But they began to find very early on that those instruments in that state weren't really sufficient for expressing their musical thoughts, especially as their abilities as musicians began to get more complex. So they began to find ways to modify these objects in order to make them better able to express their musical thoughts. But for many thousands of years, tens of thousands of years in fact, they didn't have a lot of technology to use in order to improve those objects. So many different types of instruments would have remained in a very primitive state for a very long time until we began to use technology as it began to develop, and then they applied that to the development of musical instruments. If you've been in the museum before, you know that I spend a lot of time talking about this, and I concentrate on the flute family when I talk about this. We have a really wonderful flute collection here in the museum, and it's really able to show the chronology of the development of the flutes from very early stages until the modern version. Now, a lot of these principles that I'm going to talk about apply to other musical instrument families as well, but I can demonstrate it really well with the flute. So, the first type of flute we have here is a flute from the Renaissance period. As you can see, it just has a few holes in the front of it. It would have been perfectly adequate to play the music of its time. Now, it's also basically a hollow wooden tube, and this is the way that flutes would have existed for a very long period of time until they began to use the technology available to them to begin to improve them. And we also had the Industrial Revolution, but even before that, in the Renaissance, they began to use technology to improve musical instruments. But at first it was just poking these holes in the instrument just so that you could play different notes. But then we began to add mechanical elements that would improve the playability and the versatility of these instruments. This is a flute from the Baroque period, and as you can see, there's one new key that's made out of metal that was added to this flute and actually made it quite a bit more versatile than the flutes that came before it. So what you can see, though, is that musical instrument manufacturers, in addition to being good craftsmen, also had to know something about acoustics and to have some mechanical expertise as well. As we moved on into the Baroque period, out of the Baroque period into the classical period, which we're talking about composers like Haydn and Mozart now, you can see that instruments are getting quite a bit more complex. And sometimes this addition of technology happened in a very haphazard fashion, and we needed to have instruments standardized so that every flute or every other musical instrument was played in the same way. We finally got to this with the flute in about 1850, when a German flute-playing silversmith named Theobald Boehm came up with this flute, which we now consider to be the modern flute. And the fingering system was so fantastic that it allowed flute players to play through the whole, chromatically through the whole range of the instrument and play in any key. And the important thing to know about this is that flutes hadn't easily been able to do that before if they'd been able to do it at all. In addition, Boehm's fingering system was so fantastic that it was essentially ruthlessly stolen by the manufacturers of other instruments, other woodwind instruments. It was applied to the oboe and the bassoon with various degrees of success, but we have Boehm system clarinets, and then when Adolph Sax came along and invented the saxophone, he adapted the Boehm fingering system for the saxophone. So, one of the things that I want to make sure that you remember the next time you have your instrument out of your case is that all of our instruments now are wonderfully sophisticated and versatile, but they weren't always that way. And so think about musicians of 150, 200, 300 years ago who played different versions of the instruments that we play today, and how much better and how much more repertoire we have to play because of that. I hope that you all are well and safe, and keep looking at our social media pages this summer for more really interesting content. And we hope to see you all back here in 2021. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.